Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you.
Oh, don't you know it's the Bill Arnold Show? It's Bill.
And a warm welcome to the Bill Arnold Show. I would say over the last couple of months, every day I come into the studio and I say, Wyatt, when is J. Warner Wallace coming back? I think I said that every day. Then here he is. He's written an amazing book. If you're a fan of detective novels, comic book style, oh my. Case Files Volume 1, Murder and Meaning, is out. It came out April 1st, and it's a full-color graphic novel written by J. Warner Wallace and his son Jimmy. And it is, it's a page turner. It's beautiful. I've got my hands on one, and it is great. And we're going to talk about that to get things started. Lots happened since you were last on, Jim. I got to be honest. It's nice to have you back.
Well, you start off by lying about saying that you've been asking about me every day. Come on now.
Was at least every week, wasn't it?
It was every other day.
Okay, every other day.
Right,
there you go.
Okay, cool. Now I can believe that. Okay, that's different.
Well, no, that's actually true. I thought, well, I hope you're having a good summer. I know you're in Alaska doing amazing work. And I know
I'm not sure it was amazing, but it was challenging and really rewarding.
Yeah,
for sure.
Tell us about that, because I know it's of huge interest to people, including me.
Well, as part of it is, we're in a culture right now where we're kind of like wondering what is going on and how do we move forward, right? I mean, what do we? And it's kind of at the tip of that spear, for the most part, whether people think about it or not, is our law enforcement community, right? Because so much of this is going to be shouldered by either first responders, law enforcement who are responding to the scenes of these tragedies, or by the investigators who follow up after them. And sometimes after they have these experiences in these tragedies, they are shaken themselves. I almost wonder sometimes if it's generational. Like my dad's generation was maybe a little different than my son's generation doing the same job as a first responder, as a police officer. But it does take a toll. And if that starts to impact people's way of thinking about life and their level of depression or the level of anxiety or their level of functioning, and if it starts to impact their marriages, for sure, Billy Graham Association has a program, and it's on their website, the BGA website. It's their law enforcement marriage resiliency retreat, and it's really designed, especially in more turbulent times right now, to help officers who are struggling to figure out, like, what are we doing here, and how do I survive this in my own headspace and keep on functioning well? Because I think about it all the time. I mean, a lot of these officers are getting involved in critical incidents, and they're shaken so deeply that they end up accessing a medical retirement or some kind of it actually can impact the way they see the world. And a lot of it is just based on their worldview when they first encounter the incident. If you think about what trauma is, Bill, it really is that we have a view of the world in which we have certain expectations that come with that view of the world. We think the world is a certain way and it ought to function in a certain way. And then something happens that absolutely makes no sense to us. It shatters our expectations of the world, and to the point where we're like not quite sure what to believe anymore. And so that trauma can be something very dramatic or something less dramatic. The question is, did you hold a worldview before the event that now cannot process the event? It can't make sense of the event. And that's why, starting with the idea of what is true about the world. Is Christianity true? If it is, it's a certain kind of story that has chapters. And we watched our Savior move through these kinds of chapters. And this is why God comes to us incarnate and moves through the chapters that human beings move through, including all of the suffering. Of course, not for this purpose. He doesn't do this so we can live a better life. He doesn't do this to show us the way necessarily. Of course, it does show us a way. He came to pay the price for our sin. But in the process, we can learn something about God's overarching story so we can figure out what chapter we are in at any given time, including the chapters that seem quite tragic, like the ones we've experienced in the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. He's a former Los Angeles homicide detective. And Jim, when I think of what went on in Minneapolis not that long ago with the shooting at the church and the Annunciation School, I can't imagine what it would be like for a police officer to go in there and see a dead child, which may look much like their own. I don't know how you ever get over that.
I have a case just like that I remember responding to the death of a 6-year-old.
Oh.
And there were people who, the way he was murdered, there were people who, when they walked in, they had 6-year-olds of their own.
Oh, boy.
And they simply said, look, I remember one of them came in and said, I'm gone. I can't stay. And of course, my response to that is that, okay, so who stays? How do we solve this? How do we move the case forward? How do we do anything if we don't adopt a worldview that helps us to deal with trauma, that helps us to deal with the tragedies we're going to face? And it doesn't hurt to have a worldview that sees the world differently. It's not, if you're somebody who believes that every desire has to be met, every desire for justice, every desire, every passion of your heart has to be met within the 80 years you get to live on planet Earth, then you're going to be probably gravely disappointed several times. Because if you think life is just that line segment we used to talk about all the time, you and I, between, birth and death, that 90-year line segment, well, then everything has to be solved in that 90 years in order for you to feel some kind of satisfaction. Every crime has to be addressed. Every desire has to be met. On the other hand, if it's a ray that begins at birth, extends through the point we call death, and often to infinity, on the other side of the second dot, the thing we used to call death, is the most robust and realized version of our life that we're ever going to experience. And it'll help us if we have an eternal worldview to process what's happening on the temporal side of the second dot. On the side, the space between the two dots is very small compared to what's going to occur on the other side of the second dot. And that's why I think that having the right kind of worldview can help you to process. Also, I don't think I ever went into a death scene like that where I thought I was looking at anything other than broken eggshells, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the eggs are gone. What we have left is just the shell. And if you can separate those two things, if we believe we are soulish creatures and that children at that age are immediately in the presence of the Savior, the minute they close their eyes, and as a matter of fact, if you couldn't talk them into coming back once they're in the presence of God, and they're just basically going to say, "Hey, just relax. You're going to be here in the blink of an eye."
Right.
I'd rather wait here for you than go back with you. That's the difference between what's happening between the two dots and what happens on the other side of the second dot.
Mm-hmm. Jim, I've repeated several times something I heard you say maybe a couple of years ago where you said, I cry for my wife, my kids, my dog, not my cat. And I know you were just being funny about that. But if you don't have a certain boundary, you're going to be weeping all day long as a police officer.
Well, okay, so let's think about what we consider to be traumatic. The trauma that we will encounter police officers in this ministry who have had to take someone's life. They've been pushed to that point where they're stopping another killer, and they've had to take someone's life. And regardless of what that person, maybe they really did the most ultimate good they could have by stopping a future murder, or stopping a murder that's happening right there in front of them by taking the life of somebody. It doesn't make it any easier to take that life. And often they will struggle on the backside of that. And that kind of trauma is real. Now, I want you to think for a minute. So much of it is your worldview. I'll give you an example of this. Look at David's mighty men. Okay, David's mighty men. Everyone who got to be called one of the mighty men, I'm sure, relished that title and would have done anything to protect that title. They were the elite. They were the ones who were David's might. That's a positive adjective in the Hebrew. So these mighty men, how did they become mighty? Well, they had to go into battle. Mm-hmm. And instead of shooting someone from across the room, they had to get close enough to the combatant that they could see the whites of his eyes. And they would take a sharp instrument and basically hack the person to death. Okay? Let me just think about it for a second. Yeah. That's what war was until we invented firearms. And these folks often suffered their own grave injuries that they would have to heal up from for a couple of weeks or a month or 2 months or 3 months just to go back into battle again. I think a lot of us would be traumatized deeply. But I suspect that that generation, given what they were facing and the worldview they held, would have been more traumatized to not have performed well than to just have to do what they had to do. Like it was like a rite of passage, I'm sure, for many of these
Sure.
men to become one of the mighty men. Well, what makes something that is not as traumatic a generation ago more traumatic now? It's the lessening of a worldview. As we let go of the Christian worldview, we are letting go of an eternal worldview. And we're also, obsessed with how other people feel about us rather than the audience of one that we should be concerned about, how the audience of one sees us. We are now, if you don't believe there's an audience of one that really is watching and that you are there that's the one you want to hear well done from, well, then you're going to be obsessed with what people think of you. And that's a fickle place to be.
Isn't that the world that most people are living in, though, right now?
Well, of course it is.
Yeah.
And when we have these kinds of tragedies that occur, right before our eyes, and we have to watch them, I think that's when we somebody described it as when you shoot a flare up into the nighttime sky, it lights up the entire region, and you can see where everybody is, like where they really are standing in that dark environment. And I think what these events have done in the last month or so is they have systematically given us light so we can see where are you on your belief spectrum? Where are you in your worldview? Are you somebody who is embraced such a cultural, secular worldview that you no longer have the tools that are necessary to even help you get through trauma?
Mm-hmm. Jim, psychologically, what's going on with what we are seeing on television, which is available 24/7 on the internet, is what kind of impact is that having? I mean, there was a time when we didn't have access to this kind of footage of what's gone on in the world, and I'm not sure we should be seeing it over and over and over.
Well, I think we take it for granted how visually dependent we are.
Oh, yeah, good point.
I mean, all idolatry really starts with what we can see. So we should be worshiping this God, but he appears to be hidden to us often.
Mm-hmm.
But the things he has created are right in front of us. They're tangible. We can see them immediately. So we end up fixating often on good things that God has created rather than on the God who created them. Why? Because the good things are sitting right in the same room with us. Then we fixate on the things we can put our eyes on. Well, I think you got to guard. This is why it's so important to guard your eyes from certain things,
Amen.
right?
Yeah.
Is that you want to be able to protect yourself, protect the innocence of your children, for example, for as long as you possibly can. Because that's once they've seen something, you can't unsee it, as they often say. And I think we're in a world right now where, number one, I don't think that I used to think, well, gosh, this visual world we're in is kind of shortening our attention span. I don't think it is. I just think what it's doing is it's making everything has to be so vivid that we will become numb to all the nuanced subtleties that used to impress us, right?
So true.
Because even in literature, in the kinds of, do we have the patience to sit through a slowly unwrapping story that has very nuanced kind of movements, even or is it everything at kind of at screaming pitch, where if it's not at this kind of, it's a very noisy world.
Yeah.
Can something that's not as noisy be as impactful? This is why I have a young man who's helping me on my social media platforms. He clips all the videos and puts them on YouTube, but that's not something that I actually do. I provide him with all of the interviews I've done over the years, and he finds now, what is he looking for? Well, of course, he's looking for the most provocative, and I'm not a provocative person, I don't think. So it's hard for him probably to find what he wishes he could find that then he could title in some way to get attention to the videos, because that's just not who I am.
Right.
But I think if that was and this is why you see the people when they're getting ready to record something, and they can make up anything they want for their platform, they are often compelled to do the stuff that will grab the attention of people in a noisy environment. And the only way you grab that attention in a noisy environment is to kind of scream louder sometimes, or to be more vivid in your details, or to be more dramatic, or to pick only the hot button topics and stay on those. Look, I believe that everything is downstream of the gospel. That's it. And I don't need to work from current events first to present the gospel to you. I would rather work from the gospel. Because if you believe that Jesus is who he said he was, that he rose from the grave, then you're more likely to listen to somebody who rose from the grave. And if that's who he is, he's a different category of teacher. And if I actually end up loving and submitting to the teaching of Jesus, well, then all that other, you're going to find all of a sudden, no, I guess I don't believe that thing over there anymore. I guess I don't. Yeah, I guess like you will submit your desires and your values and your priorities to the God of the universe, and then no one like me will have to make a case for your values. That's going to be the natural outcome of your beliefs, your trust in Jesus as Lord.
Mm-hmm. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. I want to also remind you, Case Files Volume 1, Murder and Meaning, is available. And you talk about real-life experiences in a high-stakes action storytelling way. It is spectacular. And you can learn more about that at coldcasechristianity.com. If you have a question or comment, the text line is open, 877-933-2484. I'll be right back with Jim. We carry each other's burdens. Please know you can bring us your prayer concerns and we will pray. Share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio team by texting or calling 877-933-2484 or share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio staff and listeners at myfaithradio.com. My guest today is J. Warner Wallace, and Jim, say hi to Amy.
Hi, Amy.
Yeah, she just sent a text in. She said, 2 days ago, I was seriously thinking of texting and asking when J. Warner Wallace was coming back. I'm so thrilled. See what I mean? I'm not the only guy walking around the studio going, when is Jim Wallace back?
I got to figure out which family member Amy is right now so I can call her and thank her for saying something like that. That's so funny.
Let's talk a little bit about the book that you and your son wrote. It's a wonderful book. It's a beautiful book. You're going to love it. And it's based on real life experiences. And the story is centering around Detective Michael Murphy. Murph, they call him. And he's in near retirement. He's been in the Los Angeles County for 25 years of experience. Sounds familiar, Jim.
Well, it's not autobiographical
by
any means.
I know.
But I think what it is, yeah. But every person in it is somebody that we've worked with. You know, we just kind of and it seems like every generation of cop has people in these iconic kinds of places in your. So if you are a cop, for example, and you read this book, and it's a graphic novel, it's hard to explain because it's not just like a book that you open up and it's got pages and a story in it. It really feels like a collectible, you know, it's like this heavy, colorful, shiny page, a piece of art. We didn't draw it; it was drawn by people who are professional artists who do this kind of thing. So it's a graphic novel. It's like a 6 comic books all bound into one. And the idea here is that it tells a story in a way that's visual, that maybe it makes it easier, more. And what we're trying to do is not be preachy. Like we want to be able to do this in a way that people, when they read it, go, oh, this made me think a little bit. I can see now where the Christian worldview has value in this area or that area, without having a cast of characters that are all Christians, or that at the end of the story everyone's going to get baptized. No, it's a murder mystery. You know, it's a murder mystery in which we're solving a serial murder case involving that makes people think about how you evaluate your own identity, how do you evaluate your own worth, what makes human life valuable. What makes one life, and we saw this, right? We've seen now in the last week how, so in the same time, by the way, at the same time, in the last 10 days, I don't know how many men have been murdered in the United States. Yeah. But when one man is murdered like this, it gets all of our attention. Now, why? Of course, that has to do with a lot of things, right? But we have to ask this kind of fundamental question. And I think when it comes down to families, you can ask the families. The family of any murdered man in America is going to go through the same thing that the family of Charlie Kirk is going through. And we totally understand why it's captured the attention of the entire world. Right? But I think Charlie would be the first one to tell you that our identity is not grounded in our achievements or our notoriety or even our impact. Who we are, our value, our purpose is because we have been created in the image of a holy God. And when you start to ground your value in any of the other things, you'll find that those can be taken from you or they can be devalued, or you'll see right now how divided the country is about how they feel about you. All of those things do not determine your value. What determines your value is your identity in Christ. And I think Charlie would be the first one to say that.
No, he would for sure.
So for us, it's about like, how do we, if, we wrote this book last May, and the question is, how do we, in this year that we're talking about it, is we want young people, and I don't think graphic novels anymore are just for young people. I think that you see that the demographics on graphic novels are actually very broad. It's one of the, I think it's the fourth most popular genre of literature right now that's being sold. Surprising to us, but it's visual, and we hope that we're going to bite the apple from a different direction, so that when you get done, you go, yeah, there are several ways that I'm tempted to ground someone's value. But the truth is, every time I go outside of grounding it in the nature of God and that we are created in his image, you eventually get sideways. So we're trying to make that point in this book.
Yeah, and the book does a fantastic job of providing spiritual insights, and this is something that I think readers will absolutely love when they get the book.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think it really is part, like, we have to start to think about, and this is the legacy I think we've been left, is how do we find a way to have the hard conversations with people, where we still represent the fullness of God's truth and grace, justice and mercy. How do we do both of those? How do we bring both of those to the forefront, so that when we have a conversation, and we're trying to speak truth, that the memory of the person who comes away from that is also that he has a sense of graciousness that that he wouldn't otherwise have if we were just trying to be heard in a noisy world.
Mm-hmm. Jim, what kind of truths do you share about human nature in the book?
Well, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of human nature is identity is a core need of all humans, and how we see ourselves is the single. Researchers have kind of posited this as the single most important variable in terms of how we will do both in mental health, physical health, which is all somatic from mental health, and all the other kinds of markers we look at for human flourishing. Identity matters. And I think it's a driving force we don't even see. It's hidden. It's what drives me to get up in the morning. Who am I? What am I here to do? What's my purpose? By the way, purpose, meaning, value are all kind of synonyms for the idea of identity, because we draw one from the other. So if you think of yourself as a radio broadcaster, or as somebody as a journalist, or as somebody who's a thinker who wants to work in the public square, if you think of yourself this way, then you kind of get up every morning knowing what your mission is. It's when we are wondering, who am I, that we struggle. And all so what we're doing here is we're trying to present a number of stories from a number of characters who are looking at the question, who am I? Why do I still matter? And what grounds my value to begin with? And so some of those guys are going to be detectives who are like Murph, who's at the end of a career and wondering, like, who am I now? We've got a killer on the loose who is targeting what he thinks are more publicly valued targets with each murder, starting with somebody he doesn't think is publicly valuable at all, and then moving all the way up to who he thinks is the most important figure in the city. And he's doing this to make a point, because he's also got this question that he wants the detectives to address, because he wasn't treated a certain way. So there's all these different themes that are coming together that we are trying to, like I say, bite that apple from many sides. But really the issue of, and look, we're only called Christians 3 places in the entire New Testament. When Paul talks about us as believers, when John talks about us as believers, he talks about both of those two will talk about us as those who are in Christ or are in him. You could argue that if your identity is not in Christ, if that isn't the place where you form everything else, that you're not even a Christian at all. I think we sometimes think that our Christian identity is like, yeah, I should put it first. Like I have this post where the signs are all up there, detective and father and mother, or you're a mother, or you're a son, or you're a daughter, or you have this business you run, or I'm the author of these books. And I also have this Christian identity sign. And I guess what Jim's saying is we should all have the Christian identity sign at the top of the post. And that's not really what I'm saying. I think you and I have talked about this before. I want us to realize that from God's perspective, your Christian identity is not another sign that kind of fits in with all the other signs you have about who you are. Instead, it's the post upon which every sign is nailed.
Oh, I love that.
And that's the difference, right? Because if I have my Christian identity as the post, well, then I'm going to father different.
Yeah,
I'm going
amen.
to work. I'm going to work cases differently.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I'm going to be a different kind of husband because my identity is not just another sign. It's the post that holds every other sign.
Oh, it's such a great image, Jim. That's
So that's
awesome.
why I think we have to kind of shift. And this book is really trying to figure out, like, how do you look? We don't want to preach that. We want a detective mystery, and I want this thing to work on its own before you ever look back at it and say, well, what was the overarching message, right? So anyway, this is why I think we're trying to, and also we're trying to do it in a creative way because we know that I've already written books that just make a case.
Right.
What we're doing here is trying to write some fiction that kind of suggests something very powerful without having to preach it.
Yeah, you can intrigue people with some philosophical questions that are in the book that can further the conversation that might
that's
turn
the
to
hope.
faith.
Right. And this is why this idea of being a kind of a less combative and more engaging dialogue is it possible to do this anymore? And I wonder sometimes the way that social media is, if we're just in a generation where it's just not going to be possible until we change the social media culture. Like, I wonder, try as you might, if the structure of social media stays the same, I'll give you an example of this? If you just had one rule change in social media, here it is. In order to have any social media account, you have to have a verifiable, real picture of who you are with your address posted on the social media account right next to your picture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the dialogue between people on social media would change?
Yes, immediately.
Yeah, immediately. And what's killing us is the anonymity.
Mm-hmm.
Or the sense that we're never really going to have to confront that person face to face. And so I think that we have to be in a place eventually where we say, okay, because we're never going to act as though we are not anonymous as long as you allow us to remain anonymous.
True.
So we have to change the culture of the social media in order to change the kind of moral rules for how we behave on social media.
But I remember growing up, Jim, if you ever wanted to send your opinion to the newspaper, you'd have to type a letter, you'd have to figure out the name of the editor, you'd have to put it in an envelope, you'd have to put a stamp on it, you'd have to send it. And now you just sit behind your keyboard and fire away anything you want anonymously.
Yeah, and it's just that's right. And it's the anonymity, I think, in the sense of distance. That's why we're so outraged when someone is outed, when someone is like, oh, now they know who I am. Well, it turns out that there would be no reason to out people for offense if people were out from the beginning. Right, if they were actually in front of their posts and were, like, for example, I'll bet you have said something to someone on social media that you would never say to the person living next door to you in the neighborhood.
That's so true.
Because they know where you live, and you have to live with that guy. And there's a sense of not being connected. And this is why one of the things we look at when we look at suspect pools that are willing to do outrageous things, they typically don't have strong structures of accountability, like relationships. Like, hey, I could never do this because my dad, I'd shame my father. I'm not going to shame my family name. I'm not even going to take the chance of shaming my family name. Why? Because I have a strong accountability structure with my family. It's when people start to get disconnected and their only relationships are with people who they've only known for a few years. Right? They don't have any long-term accountability to them. Mm-hmm. Well, that's when you get to a place where because if you're not allowing the Word of God to restrain your fallen nature, like you're not submitting your fallen nature to God's Word, often people who don't even know anything about God will at least submit their fallen nature to the family brand because they don't want to mess up the brand, or they don't want to disappoint a wife, or they don't want to disappoint their kids. It's when you find people are disconnected from all of those relationships that they're far more likely to say, I don't have anyone to disappoint, so I can do whatever I want.
Mm-hmm. Jim, should I send people to Cold Case Christianity, or is there somewhere else to go to get information about the book?
No, just go to coldcasechristianity.com. We write books because this is the creative scratch that we itch that we scratch. Right? So that's just who we are. But I hate the idea of selling books.
I know you do. It's one of the things I really like about you.
So just that website will kind of show all the stuff we're doing, and we try to provide 3 free pieces of content a week. So I always say exhaust everything an author will give you for free before you invest any money in them.
That sounds good. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. If you have a question or comment, the text line is open, 877-933-2484. And again, it's coldcasechristianity.com. We'll be right back.
Bill needs a minute. He needs a minute. Bill needs a minute. He'll be right back. Bill needs a minute. He just needs a minute. Bill needs a minute. He'll be right back. Bill took a minute, and now he's back.
So glad to be back with J. Warner Wallace. He's my guest. His book that he wrote with his son Jimmy is called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. Got a nice text that just came in, Jim. This is, why do you think it's important that people want to know the motive to why people commit crimes?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, it does help us to justify. But for example, let's say you had a pool of five. Well, for two ways of looking at it. One is from a criminal perspective in terms of prosecution. The other is from a social perspective. Why do we just want to know? So from a criminal perspective, often what we're trying to show, and not as though we have to necessarily know what motivated somebody. If I've got enough forensic evidence that he's the shooter based on DNA, or he's the killer, he's got a knife and it's his knife. He owns that knife. His DNA is on that knife. He cut himself in a way that's in other words, we have enough forensic evidence. We might still have the open question, but why was he so angry enough to do this? But if I have enough evidence to show that he did it, I don't often have to show, why he did it. But if I've got three candidates for this, and only one has this strong, pressing motive that would cause him to want to do it before the end of this week, and she happens to die before the end of this week, well, then that motive becomes part of this evidence package, right? Because it even accounts for the timing of the murder. Now, why do we care as a culture? I think we care because we are horrified that something like this could happen. And of course, we want explanations. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, we hate to think that our culture is just so broken that there really isn't even a need for a good explanation. If your kids did something and you think, my kids are good kids, then you're going to want to know, well, why did you do this? It's not just part of your nature, is it? No, there must have been a good reason. So sometimes motive is a way that when we seek a motive like this, we are just trying to understand how it could have broken so badly. Sometimes we want to know that because we're trying to console ourselves that things aren't really as bad as we think. And this is where this nasty process of trying to justify something comes up, right? Mm-hmm. And I think here's what we would say as Christians. We are not in the garden anymore. Oh. And we are between the garden and paradise. We're between the two gardens. And we're in that broken in-between that is just called the life, the world we live in. And we know it's broken. We know that everyone in the broken in-between is fallen by nature. We are not innately good people that are somehow corrupted by systems, and we got to figure out why the system broke the way it did, because otherwise this young person, this young man, this young woman, whoever it is who did this crime, whatever the crime may be, it only happened because the system somehow corrupted this kid. Or the converse might be true, where we are the corruptors of all systems, all families, all political systems, because we, by our very nature, are fallen, and just as the Scripture describes. Mm-hmm. And if the Bible is true, well, then it provides us with a whole nother set of. I often work cold cases where the guy gets away with it, and then for 30 years does an excellent job of covering and just being a regular guy. And even serving his community well, being just the opposite of what he was in that moment when he took that person's life. And you would think there's no way a guy like this could be capable of that.
Doug Bradford.
Well, it's only, yeah, exactly. And you only think that because you think, well, this is the nature of this is the nature of humans. Humans, mm-hmm. they're either good or bad, and you can tell by hanging out with them long enough. And a good person doesn't do bad things.
Right.
Well, that's just the problem we have with our definitions of anthropology. Biblical anthropology says, no, you are created in the image of an unbelievable God. And for that reason, you are often capable of unbelievable good things. At the same time, you are deeply rebellious. And because of the fall, we're now living in that rebellious, broken in-between. And in that space, all kinds of things are going to happen. It's the enigma of man, the two sides of who you are. And this is what we see all the time. And this is why sometimes you'll see that even that commentary about the shooter last week, or you'll find someone, I am sure, who can say something surprisingly good about him. In a moment, he showed some side of himself, and you'll think, and then one side will be yelling at the other side, this is who he really is. Well, it turns out both sides are who we really are.
That's true.
Yeah, we can do both things. We
Right.
can have moments in which we can be spectacular on any measurement, and then of course we also can be so depraved that we can do something that you would think, oh, there's no way. And I've seen it happen so many times with people who've taken to jail. And we've had a hard time sometimes convincing, because what they'll of course do is they'll call every witness who over the last 30 years has had all this access to this guy and has seen that side of himself, the best version he puts on for the public after he did this horrific thing. And they have a hard, who's the jury going to believe? And that's the problem. That's why I think that worldview is the starting point for everything else. Not only how you experience and evaluate trauma, but how you even assess the nature of people. And so because look, there's a skeptic in me as a cop that just says, hey, you treat everyone like a crook anyway. But you can't really do that, right? Because if you do that, you'll find yourself, that's not a good way to run your family for sure.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is, but that is my default nature. That wasn't a hard thing for me to accept, let's put it that way, as a new believer at 35. At 34, I had met my share of people who were duplicit. So it didn't shock me that, that as a matter of fact, that the Christian worldview seemed to explain that duplicity better than any other worldview.
Interesting. You already answered the next comment that came in on the text line. Please ask Jim to explain the evidence that we are created in the image of God and the significance of it. Well, you just did that. Nice job.
Well, and I think part of it too is that what evidence do we have that any of this narrative is true? So much about what I believe about the Old Testament claims are because I tested the New Testament claims. Because it turns out that if you really believe that the evidence for the man named Jesus, who demonstrated through the power of God by doing all those miracles and rising from the grave and teaching a worldview that put the entire world on its ear, if you believe that man rose from the grave, that he is God incarnate, then when he affirms the Old Testament teaching on any particular issue, you can trust that it's true. Even though you may not be able to apply the same kind of manuscript evidence test that you can apply to the New Testament, you may not be able to do that for the Old Testament. That's okay, because it's much more ancient. It's not going to have the same kind of chain of custody you have with the New Testament. But that's okay, because you now have somebody who rose from the grave who is affirming the Old Testament. Like I always say, if you come out of the grave, I am probably inclined to listen to you.
Excellent point. Jim, I'm curious as to how deluded or deceived people must be to think that they can get away with anything like what happened in the last week.
Yeah, I know. Well, first of all, I mean, if you've ever investigated anything forensically on digital platforms, you realize that there's nothing that really goes away.
Right.
And there's nothing that can't be recovered based on what kind of search warrant you might be able to write for it. And so yeah, I think that. But this is what's interesting about social media use. We have created small pockets and small communities that feel isolated, that feel safe when they're not safe at all. But they feel like, hey, I've been in this community now for 2 years, and it's only the 12 of us, and we're constantly back and forth, and there's no interruption in that dialogue, and we're the only ones to talk. So there's a sense in which, meanwhile, there's millions of people on the platform who have a similar feeling of protected isolation. But they're not, of course. There's anything is access. Well, why do you think, for example, some of this stuff will happen on X? Which has got, because it turns out I've got a pretty large platform on X for a small guy, but do I know what's going on? No, there's millions and millions of conversations going on X that I am not privy to, and in one of those, somebody might be discussing something heinous that's about to happen tomorrow, and no one's even going to know it until they do a forensic deep dive 2 weeks from now. And in the meantime, because there's a sense in which I'm speaking with some privacy here, because I'm part of millions of conversations, and no one's going to be looking through all these millions of conversations. But of course, that's the perception. It's an illusion that you feel like you're safe on these environments because you're in dialogues with the same 10 people, when in fact there's nothing safe. There's a footprint that's left, and so you have a trail behind you forever. And at some point, I thought it was interesting to watch this unwrap evidentially, because my first question is, if you think you can get away with it, well, then you just say nothing. You don't need to tell anybody. You don't need to forecast anything, because the idea is you're not going to die as part of this cause. You're not going to do this assassination with the expectation that you're going to get caught and either take your own life or go to jail. If you think I can actually get away with this, I can actually walk. Well, then the only way that's going to happen is if nobody else knows anything about it. And I think once he realized that the cameras had caught enough detail that people were going to recognize him, then the communication actually it became even more frequent, right? Because you kind of know, I'm probably not going to get out of this. But the idea that you would talk by way of anything other than face-to-face conversations is because there's a perception that in the digital world, you are kind of having virtual face-to-face conversations, and you're not.
It's so interesting. When you start to hear things like his roommate saying, I had no idea, doesn't that just send off red flags in your head? Like, well, that's not a person being honest.
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah, exactly. Well, here's why I would say that. I only would say it because I need to have more access to the entire breadth of conversations that are happening digitally between the two. Mm-hmm. Here's why I say that. Because some of these things, if you find you're reading conversations that almost feel like they're theatrical in the sense that they are very robust, and not the kind of thing you would typically expect a 22-year-old to say back and forth in text messages. Often our text messages to people we know really, really well are so brief that somebody on the outside, if you read them, would go, what does that even mean?
Right.
Because the guy I'm texting knows what it means, because I only need a couple of words with him. We've already had conversations that fill in the blanks. If my conversations with him on the text messages are so robust that there are no blanks at all, well, then I do become suspicious, because I'm thinking that almost feels like you're writing it for me to read rather than for him to read.
Right.
Because if you're writing it to him, you can just do it in slang. You can do it with many small emojis, or you can do it with just brief abbreviations. But if you're doing it to me and I don't know you, you have to kind of spell out every word and put periods at the end of the word and all of that. And so I think I want to see, because I don't have access to that, it's hard for me to know. But that would be the tip, I think, at least. If you saw that what appeared to be more robust and detailed than you would expect with an acquaintance you know really well. We typically have a shorthand version of communicating with people we know really well. Mm-hmm. Like if you saw my communication with my wife, at times it's going to feel really like shorthand. And if you saw me communicating with somebody I don't know at all, setting up a speaking event, well, now it's going to be like more in paragraph form. Well, that's because you don't abbreviate as much with people you don't know well. And I think that's what I'd be looking for here, is just to show me how robust are those messages. Are they abbreviated like you would expect, or do they kind of appear to be written? And especially, when are they written? Are they written after the fact? So timing of when they were written and how robust they are would be two things I'd be looking at.
So interesting. We're going to take a break and be right back. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. Go to coldcasechristianity.com. Check out his new book, Case Files, Murder and Meaning. He wrote it with his son, Jimmy. We'll be right back. It is my deepest desire that you take the very first step of faith by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. If you've got questions about what it means to begin a relationship with Jesus, text the word faith to 41224. I'm back with J. Warner Wallace. Go to Cold Case Christianity. That's his website. All kinds of great stuff there. You can check it out. And his brand new book, which came out last April, is called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. And I know, Jim, in your work, and we've talked about this a bunch in the past, is a lot of your work involves and relies heavy on circumstantial evidence. Does this show up in the book, in Case Files?
Yeah, it does. Because if you think about it, there's only two forms of evidence, direct and indirect, as you and I have always talked about. Yep. And direct evidence is just going to be eyewitness accounts. So that means that everything else that people think about evidentially, and some of the best stuff you would see on TV, like DNA and fingerprints and ballistics and blood spatter and blah, 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 blah. Well, if it's not an eyewitness account, it falls into the indirect category. And the indirect evidence is also called circumstantial evidence. So people don't typically think, for example, of a DNA hit as circumstantial evidence. But it is. So yes. I mean, it's really hard to talk about any case that's been developed in front of a jury without talking about at least some circumstantial evidence.
Mm-hmm. So the book, and I have a copy myself, and I love it. I would be curious as to what your hope would be for anyone who gets their hands and reads it that they would walk away with.
Well, okay, well, a couple things. I think number one, we always want to write gateway books that are creative. So what we mean is we're standing on the shoulders of giants in philosophy and history and theology. We're not those giants. We're just standing on their shoulders, trying to write books that are accessible, the same way you would make a case in front of a jury using experts as part of the testimony. We're doing the same thing. So what we want to do is hopefully get somebody to read a book like this and go, wow, you know what? I'd like to know a little bit more. I'd like to dig deeper in this. I'm interested in this now. So what we did in the back cover of that book is we put a quick QR code to our case closed book, which is a case that makes a brief, very brief, like 40-page case for the resurrection. Well, that idea there is that, look, if you're just interested in seeing, we only have one character in case files that is in fact a Christian. So if you're interested to see where is he getting that from, well, that's what that QR code will do. It'll take you to the next. We want this to be a gateway book that opens up to other. Now, if you're using it as an evangelical tool, like an evangelism tool, rather, well, then that's something that we want you to be better educated, right? So you can make the case even better than what we're offering in that book. So we have a link for anyone who buys the book to a bunch of resources that you can use afterwards. For example, we have a little PDF file that'll show you how to engage people in conversation about what they just read in the book, and a link to our 10.5-hour, 30-session apologetics case-making course, which is free. Once you buy the book, you just get the link and you just download those videos and all the other materials, and you can put yourself through a course that'll actually make you a pretty decent case maker, so that when you give a book like this to somebody and someone says, yeah, but what about this? You'll be able to talk about the this that they're asking about. And that's what we're trying to do. Look, in the end, what we hope to do, I'm not a Christian apologist. I'm a retired detective, but I would love it if people knew what the evidence was for Jesus. It's pretty compelling. And if we can make that case calmly, without, by the way, most of the time people start raising their voice when they run out of things to say that are reasonable. Then you raise your voice, right? It's like fight or flight.
So good.
So I think I'm pretty calm about this, because I think there's enough good evidence for this that I don't need to be a Chihuahua in a yard full of Great Danes. It turns out we have the evidence. Be the Great Dane.
No, I love that. So when you watch news of the crimes that are unfolding in the last couple of weeks, do you sit there on your couch and yell at the TV?
Sometimes.
Okay.
I know, but I know there's I'm not the brain trust of all detectives in America.
I know.
Every one of these cases, there's somebody there who's thinking the same thing I'm thinking. They're probably pursuing the same lead. I'm thinking, boy, I hope they're doing X. I hope they're doing this. And it turns out, I'm sure there's someone on that case that is doing that. But you're not going to hear about it. What we typically do is trickle out to the public so little, because when we eventually make an arrest, we want to hear that information from the arrestee, because it'll demonstrate to us that he didn't hear it on TV.
Good point.
That's information only he would have. And so we can use those kinds of statements. But if we think, well, yeah, that's already been broadcast, then you can be fooled, because you don't know it's really coming from his own experience or coming from what he's heard. So we don't put much out there, because we're trying to hold on to what could eventually be future evidence for us. So that's why I know when I'm watching it on TV, I'm thinking I'm only getting 10% of what's really happening here. That's good. We don't want to release too much. And that's when they released the pictures, is because I really thought they were probably at a point where they wanted somebody in jail as quickly as possible on this. Mm-hmm. And that was the best way to get somebody. Those are good pictures. Someone is going to see that guy and start to have problems with knowing who it is and saying nothing. And sure enough, it didn't take long. What, a day?
Right.
Even so, I knew when they started to do that. We were at a conference, Christian Apologetics Conference, and I told the other speakers he'll be in custody before the end of today. And sure enough, he was in custody before the end of today.
Wow. Jim, thank you so much for doing the show. I'll leave you with this. I just got another comment on the text line. J. Warner Wallace has got to be one of my very favorite guests you have on. There you go.
Well, you guys are so kind to me. Thanks so much for keeping me in the loop. I appreciate being here with you guys.
Well, we love you, Jim. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day. Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Bye.
J. Warner Wallace has been my guest. Go to Cold Case Christianity to learn about all of his writing and teaching and podcasts and articles he's written, and also his new book that he wrote with his son Jimmy called Case Files, Murder and meaning. You can check that out at coldcasechristianity.com. We will take a short break and be back with more in just a minute. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.
John O'Leary was 9 years old when this happened.
One moment, I was this normal little Midwest kid. And then in the next, I found myself in a hospital bed with burns on 100% of my body.
He was in the hospital for 5 painful months, but made a commitment that would change everything.
I would never be defined by those wounds. I would never be defined by those scars.
Hear John's incredible story on the latest episode of the Wow God Stories podcast. His passion will set your soul on fire and make you say,
Wow, God.
Wow, God.
Wow, God.
Wow God Stories, wherever you get your podcasts and at myfaithpodcasts.com.